Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for all coming. Before I start on the talk itself, please would you excuse me. As you will see, Anno Domini has caught up with me somewhat, plus of sundry ailments, and I can't stand up for very long. So please forgive me if I sit down. It goes against the grain, but if I sit down to do the talk, I hope you'll understand. Thank you. Yeah. Can I take you back, please, to about 1950? In the early 1950s, the UK government, led by Clement Attlee, became aware that despite Oppenheimer having violently opposed the American expansion, the Americans had in fact gone on testing nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, and the government were very well aware of the fact that they probably now had thermonuclear bombs, otherwise known as hydrogen bombs, if you prefer the definition. And worse still, it looked as if the USSR had done the same thing. Britain saw itself as being a third member of this nuclear club, but unfortunately the government were faced with the fact that we didn't have a weapon that justified that position. The Americans and the Russians had far outstripped us in terms of development. Not for the first time, as you will hear further in my talk, Attlee and his government had to decide whether to stay in the nuclear club or to walk away from it. The only way they can think of achieving staying in was to develop an independent British thermonuclear bomb. And they decided that the only way they could do that was to talk to the scientists at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment in Aldermaston. Many of you may remember the Aldermaston marches. And the scientists were required to come up with a formula which would produce an independent thermonuclear bomb. The scientists responded by coming up with 3 different designs. They were, and I don't quite know why they were called this, but they were called Green Granite, Orange Herald, and Green Bamboo. The caveat was that they stressed that they were only scientific theories. They were only on paper. They had no way of knowing what the resultant bombs would produce in terms of power, in terms of radioactive fallout, in terms of anything. It was all totally experimental. And as they pointed out, they themselves were not qualified to comment on how the bomb would be developed, meaning that there was an engineering facet to it as well. The bomb had to be contained in something, and they weren't engineers. In other words, they hedged their bets like mad because they didn't know what the impact would be when these things were let off. The scientists went on to stress that even if one of their theories proved to be practical, it didn't necessarily mean that we could have a bomb, because how are you going to store it? How stable was it going to be? Where were you going to keep it? How were you going to fly it to the target? How was it going to be manoeuvred? There were all sorts of imponderables that they couldn't determine. But it was the 3 tests to determine whether these things even worked that I personally saw and witnessed, not on Christmas Island, because Christmas Island had already been earmarked as being the base for which this operation was going to be mounted. Operation Grapple was the name it was given. In fact, actually, the 3 explosions did not take place on Christmas Island or anywhere near it. They determined that it was far too dangerous to expose the RAF crews who had an airfield on Christmas Island for the Valiant bombers, plus the Army, who were there to mount all the other logistics. And it was far too dangerous to let these things go when they didn't know what they were going to do, how they were going to react. And so it was determined that they would be let off over a coral atoll, uninhabited coral atoll, called Malden Island. And it is those 3 explosions that I was present at, not the Christmas Island explosions. We will talk about Christmas Island a little bit later on, but I would like to make it quite clear that I'm only going to talk about what I saw and what I witnessed personally. And to do that, we have to go back to when I was a very junior officer in the Royal Navy. And when I say junior, I really do mean junior. I was a midshipman, which is the lowest of the low. May I ask you to bear in mind, please, that my talk is based on my own very personal experiences as a very junior officer, and as such I was not privy to what was going on around me. And thus I will be talking about a very small part of a very significant part of a program of atomic and nuclear testing, giving the overall title of Operation Grapple. So I'm only going to talk about what I saw of Operation Grapple. Brian will take it further. Please would you understand also that I have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of nuclear physics, and actually I don't know very much about the role of the Army or indeed the RAF throughout the Grapple programme, other than what I actually saw myself, and we'll come to that. The nuclear bang, or rather bangs, because there were 3 of them, as I said, which were the subject of this talk, all took place in 1957, when I was 20, or thereabouts, some 70 years ago. It doesn't seem possible. A lot has changed in that time, not least my memory, but I'm very fortunate because as a midshipman, I had to keep personal records of my experiences, and we will share that with you this morning. Let me explain. With the prospect of national service looming, I thought I'd like to learn to fly. So I applied to join the Fleet Air Arm because I've always loved the sea. And having gone through numerous tests, one of which was to apply meteorological information to a flight plan. You'll see the significance of that a little bit later on. Anyway, having gone through all these tests, we were told that defence cuts had determined the fact that we wouldn't have any more aircraft carriers. You may have heard that before. And so we were made redundant, and I opted to serve my national service as an ordinary seaman. That is a picture actually from one of my logbooks. As an officer under training, one was obliged to write a journal. This is one of mine. That's my midshipman's journal from when I was under training. And you had it marked once a week by your schoolie, who was usually an officer trained in educating the ship's crews on a big ship. And in one occasion, as you'll hear later on, I actually met a schoolie on the ship that I was appointed to. But anyway, I met this schoolie when I was appointed to a ship, and he encouraged me not only to keep writing a journal, because I was still a midshipman. I think his eyes lit up when he inherited a midshipman who was still capable of being educated. And that is my journal from the time that I was actually a midshipman on the Narvik, on the ship that I was appointed to. It's got all my Admiralty papers, the whole lot are in there. And this is where Brian's been so brilliant, because the Admiralty were not famed for using decent paper to publish its orders. And there's newspaper cuttings, photographs, etc. from all over the place in there. And the schoolie encouraged me to make it more like a scrapbook than a logbook, to illustrate the words that I was trying to express. And Brian, bless his heart, has spent hours and hours photographing them, the content, and he's going to show them to you as we go along in the form of slides. So you're going to get a direct report from my logbook of the actual events as I saw them. And then, just to add insult to injury, I broke all the rules and kept a diary myself in which is recorded day by day exactly what was going on around me and where we were, what we did, which ships we'd seen, where we, etc. So the script that I'm going to be using comes directly from this diary and not from the internet. Right. So Brian, thank you for what you've done. We have had a long conversation. We couldn't really decide how to explore the whole topic of grapple. So we decided that the best way to do it was to look at 3 questions. The first one is, why were the UK undertaking these tests in the first place? The second one is, why was I there, or how was I there? And lastly, what were the results of the tests? What became of all the effort we put in? So I'm going to tackle the first question first, if I may. Why was the UK undertaking the tests? And the answer for that is that we need to go back to 1940, when the scientists discovered that given a modest amount of uranium, it was possible to create a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction which could be used as a bomb. I always thought the Americans got there first, or somewhere clever like Cambridge. But to my surprise, I discovered that actually it was found in Birmingham, at Birmingham University. Now, with remarkable foresight, Churchill latched onto this information, and in 1940 he created a company called Tube Alloys to develop an atomic weapon. With World War II raging round him, he could only afford a tiny amount of his defence budget, and he looked for support, both financial and technical, from elsewhere. And the Canadians responded and decided to join the project. We now know that this was not quite the good news that Churchill thought it was, since at least 3 members of the Canadian delegation which joined Tube Alloys were reporting directly to Moscow. To make matters worse, the limited budget available made it inevitable that Churchill had to look even further away, and he went to his old friend and ally Roosevelt, and the whole of Tube Alloys ventures was absorbed into the Manhattan Project, including the Canadian spies. The Manhattan Project, as you probably know, was in fact actually this American scheme to develop nuclear weapons led by Oppenheimer. As you probably know, one of the outcomes of the project was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in a moment, we're going to show you 2 slides which I still personally find very disturbing. The first picture, which was taken after Hiroshima had been attacked in August of 1945, and the second pictures of Nagasaki. Brian, can we put those up, do you think? This is the picture of Hiroshima, and that was a bomb which developed, and I ask you to remember this if you could please, 16 kilotons. Okay, that's just 16 kilotons did that. And then Nagasaki, and that is the result of a 25 kiloton bomb. Please remember those if you can. We'll come back to them later on. The result of the devastation shook the world. And for the UK, 2 further events held huge influence. Firstly, the Americans realized that their defense secrets had been compromised, and in 1946 they passed the McMahon Act banning the sharing of military secrets with foreign powers. And secondly, Churchill lost his premiership and Attlee became Prime Minister. And it was Attlee's government that had to decide whether to stay at the top table of world affairs, which meant being a nuclear power, and guaranteed a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, or whether to walk away with no further ambition. Needless to say, they chose to go it alone, persuaded by the views of Ernest Bevan, who said, I actually prefer the Punch version. Punch had it like this. And if you can't read it, it says, keeping up with the Joneses. Following the decision to go ahead independently, governments of various political persuasions authorised a whole series of tests, 45 in all actually, all of which had to be conducted in isolated and often very remote parts of the UK colonies, which usually included islands. This posed a particularly difficult logistical and accommodation problem because you need to have people on the ground, as it were, but if you're on an island, there wasn't many places to have to house them. And so the government took over a vessel by the name of HMS Narvik, and she was actually an old landing craft equipped to carry tanks and military equipment for D-Day. That's a picture of the Narvik, bless her heart. She was in fact a floating box actually. She had a flat bottom, which meant that she could go right up to the beaches. She could open her bow doors, lower her ramp, and you could load your tanks straight onto the shore. The box was completed by an upper deck, which carried landing craft, but was strong enough actually, in our case, to take helicopters. So she was actually very well equipped, as it were, for being alongside an island. From time to meet the needs of the various tasks, she was modified, and the tank deck provided space for communication centres and the Met Centre, and thus the Narvik became the support ship through the atomic and nuclear test programmes. And there is my very favourite ship. Having completed my upper yardman course and achieved the status of a midshipman, I was ordered to Chatham, where I was met by an old salt who took me under his wing as my steward. This was quite a contrast to being an ordinary seaman. He showed me to my very own cabin with my very own bed, and on the first morning I was there, he brought me my very own cup of tea. He also guided me through a couple of days of being kitted out with my uniforms, and all this having then been completed, I was ordered to meet the officer in charge of what looked to be absolute chaos. Looking out of his office window, all I could see was a grey mass of metal covered in scaffolding and crawling with dockyard workers, apparently demolishing it. However, it became gradually apparent that much of the modernisation was taking place was make the ship fit for a task that was before us. And at this point, I was told that I had been appointed as an officer on the grey mass, which in fact turned out to be HMS Narvik. And he also introduced me to the schoolie who persuaded me to write that journal. It amuses me to note actually that the authorities were very pleased to announce to the press that HMS Narvik was undergoing modernisation, so far so good, but it included many new facilities, such as the latest domestic machinery, please note the word domestic, including an electric potato peeler, an electric mixer, and wonder of wonders, a dishwashing machine. My son, who was also in the Royal Navy, pointed out to me that this the whole process of converting the Narvik for being away for 9 months and being completely refitted plus storing food and all the essentials, such as things like toothpaste and lavatory rolls and goodness knows what else, took nearly 2.5 months. Including, I have to tell you, very importantly, 117,600 cans of beer. And that was the first time that we realized that we were onto something different, because as you can see, it actually mentions the megaton. So actually, having done all that loading, we set off. We were commissioned into the fleet, because when you're under refit, you're not part of the fleet. We were commissioned into the fleet, and then eventually we were allowed to set sail, which came as a great relief, except that we only got as far as Orford Ness. The reason for going to Orford Ness was that we had to coordinate our actions with the RAF, with the bombers, with the helicopters, etc. And if you ever go to Suffolk and in that part of the world, it is now a National Trust site, and you can still see the bunkers where the detonators for our bombs were tested, and the National Trust of occasion will let you go out and have a look at them. It's not worth it, I can tell you. They're just lumps of concrete, but there we go. So then, having completed all that, we said our goodbyes to everybody, and we sailed away for a month and a day to the land where the palm trees grow. We didn't meet too many piggies, but our destination proved to be an absolutely marvellous experience. We spent 6 wonderful days on Jamaica refuelling the Narvik and ourselves, and then we went off to Colon, which is on the Atlantic end of the Panama Canal. We were played out of Jamaica by Harry Belafonte on the steel drums. It was a wonderful experience, actually. So we're now through the Panama Canal and heading for our next destination, which is Kiribati. Nowadays, the Pacific, you can fly across the Pacific in a matter of hours. But Brian has very kindly drawn a map there, as you can see, from Panama to Kiribati, and that took us 21 days. When we arrived, we found that the island had been taken over by the Air Force for the Valiant bombers and by the Army and the engineers. But happily, some of it was still undisturbed. Having established contact with the appropriate personnel on Christmas Island, both scientific and service, and we would be working with them, albeit at a distance of about 500 miles, we collected the very first mail that we had received since we left the UK. In itself, this was a no small task, since everybody wanted time and space to read their mail, and in many cases to read the bad news that was contained. But having said that, we were ordered south to reach our ultimate destination, the island of Malden, which is to be the target area. At this stage, Christmas Island was being used only as an airfield for the Valiant bombers and other aircraft, of course, and as a logistic base to support the work on Malden Island, because it was considered too dangerous to let the experimental explosions take place over Christmas Island, because there were so many personnel there. Here is a map of the difference between the two. As you can see, just above the equator, there is Christmas Island, and Brian has ringed round the location of Malden Island. In order to get from Christmas Island to Malden Island, we had to cross the line, and we did so in true naval fashion. That's our skipper, a great bloke, and the Neptune is the coxswain. And I'm not sure who his wife is, but anyway, that's how you go across the line, navy fashion, which is quite fun. And then on arrival at Malden Island, we discovered that the Army were already there. They were building the runway on the island, and they were building the housing for the cameras and all the equipment needed to film the explosions that would take place over Malden Island. They were working in the most appalling conditions. That is just one example. That's the main road, as it were, or the main street of the army camp. Until my arrival, or our arrival rather, at Malden Island, my principal duty had been as a seaman officer. But the ship's Met officer has somehow seen the report of my Fleet Air Arm experience and the fact that I'd managed to coordinate a Met report with a flight plan. And so when we'd left Panama, he asked that I be allowed, when I was off duty, to join the Met team, because he wanted backup in the team itself. And so when we arrived on Malden Island, I joined the Met team as a full member of that team. Our task was to track the wind speed, direction and various heights so that we could predict and subsequently track the probable area which might be affected by nuclear fallout and radiation, plus the optimum height at which the bombs should be launched from the aircraft and then detonated. Shortly after taking up our position off Malden Island, life on board changed very dramatically. The change from the Met team followed an order that we should launch 5 balloons every 24 hours. Now these balloons were pretty hefty things, and it may seem easy, but my diary reveals that it took a minimum of 4 hours per balloon. Initially this was to fill the balloon with hydrogen, and this was worked in temperatures of up to about 40 degrees centigrade. And that's how they were filling the balloons. And then dangling beneath the balloons were reflectors, so that we could send a radar signal up and track the balloon to work out where the wind speed or where the balloon was going, and then fed back to the machinery that we had in the Met office. All this led me to record that tension was rising, which became even more noticeable when 10 days after our new routines, we went to sea to take up our position 30 miles from the intended point of detonation in order to take part in AWRE trials and a dummy run by the Valiant bomber, which could clearly be seen, including an extraordinary manoeuvre needed to give time for the crew to get clear of the explosion from the bomb that they had just dropped. Brian is going to try and show you, I hope you're not too RAF orientated, going to try and show you, this is a Valiant bomber.
My walk-on part. I feel a little bit uncomfortable trying to demonstrate the manoeuvre of an aircraft to an audience who probably know a lot more about it than I do. But anyway, this is what Brian observed. The difficulty, as Brian's just alluded to, was how were they going to release the bomb and then get far enough away from its detonation point before they were overtaken by the blast and knocked out of the sky. And they practiced this manoeuvre for many hours, but on the live detonation they still didn't know for certain that it was going to work. But anyway, so the manoeuvre that Brian describes is this Valiant coming into a loop, and then at the apex, or just before the apex of the loop, it releases the bomb in an upward trajectory, which gives it the opportunity to get as far as it can before the bomb drops to 8,000 feet, where it detonates. And fortunately, the theory matched the practice, and it worked, and all went well. Hand back to Brian.
Yeah. No, actually, one of the bombs landed 100 yards short of the destination or intended target. One actually was 500 yards, which may not sound an awful lot of variation, but if you're only at, we were only at 30 miles, 500 yards is quite a lot actually. Anyway, so there followed trials, endless trials. We were backwards and forwards, but none of the results of what went on were filtered as far down as me with my very junior status. So I really have no idea what the results of all those tests were. But the tension was further increased by the circulation from the Admiralty of an order which Brian is putting up on the screen. Because that's so difficult to read, my wife, bless her heart, typed out exactly what that missive said from the Admiralty. It's actually, as you can see, addressed to me personally as an officer. Every officer had his own individual copy, but they said exactly the same thing. You will see that it refers to the ship, which is us. It infers that we can get out of the way of any nuclear fallout because we can steam fast enough. Well, our maximum speed was 15 knots, and 15 knots is only a brisk walk. So to actually get out of the way of a nuclear cloud is not that easy. But much more to the point, it clearly points to the fact that the authorities knew that there were the hazards to which personnel may be subjected. Burns and flash, blinding, and the effect, and this is the real killer as far as I'm concerned, of alpha, beta and gamma radiation. So they knew very, very well that they were exposing us to gamma radiation. They also knew that it could be ingested, if you read on. You could take it in through cuts and bruises, etc. So the authorities clearly knew the hazards to which we were being, or which the personnel were being exposed. And if we move on to the next slide, there are ways to protect yourself, of course. And one of them is to, if you can see in item 3, shelter stations. Well, bearing in mind that the ship had accommodation for all the crew, it would have been perfectly possible for the crew to take shelter in their own cabins, myself included. But, as you will hear, that was not to be the case. We were given goggles, we were given protective clothing, which actually I suppose you might equate to the nurses' sort of clothing when we had COVID, that sort of thing. But it didn't really make, well, we'll come to it, it didn't make that much difference. We knew that a bang was imminent when HMS Warrior turned up. Now, the Warrior was a full aircraft carrier, and we had to go alongside her, and we were ordered to refuel with every drop of fuel that we could possibly take. And that echoes, if you think about what you've just read from the previous slide, echoes the fact that we would need to be able to get clear of a nuclear cloud. So we needed to have as much fuel, but for how long? Who knows? Nobody knew. So we took our fuel aboard, and then the next confidential document, it says we had to steer clear of the cloud. And then just one last rehearsal before the bang, the Admiralty issued a missive detailing what to do at the time of explosions. And again, this is quite significant. You may not be able to read that, but I'll tell you what it says. It says that the whole ship's company was to parade on the flight deck in 2 ranks, facing starboard, as for a formal occasion. Thereafter, the authorities would broadcast over the tannoy when to sit down, cover one's eyes with one's hands, and when it would be safe to turn round and have a look. So we were made to sit on deck to watch these explosions, even though nobody knew what they were going to be. On the morning of the 15th of May, my diary tells me that I was woken at 4:15 and we sent up balloons at 5 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And then I went up on deck, put on my goggles and clothing, and went out on deck to join my crew, ready for Bang 1, now known as Green Granite. To my astonishment, we were able to see the Valiant as it came in at 45,000 feet. But The orders, as I've mentioned earlier, the falling in on 2 ranks, etc., came so thick and fast that it was no time to be afraid. We were just, I think, so preoccupied with doing as we were told. I suppose nervousness would describe my feelings for the wait for the bang itself. And that is it. Bang 1 on the 15th of May 1957. Can I add that unfortunately all the pictures from Malden Island are in black and white. So I'm afraid I don't have any coloured ones. But if you've ever seen the film of Oppenheimer, you may remember that they detonated a bomb as a trial, and you will have seen what it looked like in colour. And it's difficult to describe even now, the flickering effect of the colour before it was absorbed into the cloud. Unfortunately, I have to confess that my diary is not terribly reliable in describing the day. I think I was just totally awestruck. We released 8 balloons in the aftermath of the detonation and tracked until the early hours of the morning. And then 2 days we were given respite, and then back to full duties of 5 balloons a day. Well, you've got the picture. It just repeats itself, really, until bang 2, which followed almost exactly the same routine as bang 1. The mushroom cloud, however, now known as Orange Herald, was rather different. We went to our 30-mile station. We had I remember it vividly, very uncomfortable night because there was a huge cross sea running. We were in damage control state 1, which is the whole ship's shut down, no air conditioning, nothing, and the temperature was well over 40 degrees C. So it was a very bad night. But we survived it. In order to impress the UK's independent nuclear capability on our allies, on the Americans, or on anybody else come to that, the authorities had put HMS Alert at the disposal of the press and foreign dignitaries, or foreign representatives rather. She was stationed 35 miles away from detonations, i.e. about probably about 7 or 8 miles further away than we were. And on board was the Daily Express scientific correspondent. And he wrote what I would think of being representative of what we on Narvik experienced. So rather than me telling you what it felt like, I'm going to use his words. This is the Daily Express correspondent. He's saying that he was present at number 2 hydrogen bomb, which is what I've just said, which I saw explode this morning high over the Pacific, and is believed to pack a punch equivalent to 5 million V1 flying bombs. But to me, more significant than that is this slide. This is what he wrote about the time of the explosion. Yet bear in mind he was at least 5 miles further away from the explosion than we were. That explains exactly how it felt. We were then given a break. It was lovely. We were sent off down to Tongariro, where we played cricket with the locals and went to church service. I've never sung God Save the Queen, so anyway, quite weird. And they gave us that break. But then it was back to Malden Island after a couple of days. And once again, Warrior appeared, we refueled, and then she went back to her 50-mile away station, and we went back into our routine for bang 3, purple granite. And that's what that looked like. My diary says that this was the most beautiful and powerful of the 3 tested, And rather fascinatingly, in an office right next door to our Met office, we had a breakthrough. The chief scientific officer was on board HMS Narvik, and his office was right next door to ours. And that was fitted with a display panel on which he could see the bomb and how it was behaving when in the Valiant aircraft and whilst it was falling. And that is very significant because it allowed the results of the tests on Malden Island to be developed so that they could continue to think about what to do on Christmas Island. But Brian will come to that. I think that's extraordinary how they could install that inside a bomb, actually. I can't get my head around that one. Anyway, so that was really the end of the tests on Malden Island. It was concluded that they'd run the 3 tests. Nothing had horribly happened, it appeared. They hadn't analysed the results. But in any event, I was now, of course, redundant in terms of being in the Met team, and I went back to being a deck officer. And oh, lo and behold, during Bang 2, I was promoted to a sub-lieutenant, which meant more cigarettes. Anyway, apparently our job was finished, and so on the 10th of July we were instructed to proceed to Los Angeles and then to Panama, Jamaica and home. And so we set sail and steamed steadily away from Malden Island for 2 blissful weeks, being at sea on our own. And then one morning it all shattered. We were ordered to stop, and then we were ordered to return to Christmas Island. Not a very happy crew. We got back on the 22nd of July, and I have to confess I wouldn't have chosen the location for my 21st birthday. But on my 21st birthday, on the 23rd of July, and there being no senior duties, because obviously if you're at sea, you can't have a mess dinner, or not quite a full mess dinner. Because we were at Christmas Island, I was accorded a mess dinner, and the menu of which read like that. And you will notice it mentions poached whale, and poached whale was the Lieutenant Commander Whale was the schoolie who'd take me all the way through the... Anyway, so now that's me really, I suppose, because we're now parked on Christmas Island, and I think I'm going to pass over to Brian to interpret why we were called back.
Thank you. You probably realise that the decision to recall the Narvik and send it back to Christmas Island wasn't really to give Brian a slap up 21st. In fact, it marked a significant change of plan, because analysis of the 3 tests on Malden Island confirmed that none of them had produced the yield expected of a thermonuclear weapon, and so the whole lot was considered to be something of a disaster. And that was a great disappointment to the government and a great embarrassment too, who they were trying to impress their other colleagues. But what the test did highlight was that where the designs could be improved. And so the decision was very quickly made from those on high to modify the design and to conduct a second series of tests. And the location for those was decided to be on Christmas Island. So it was decided to mothball Malden Island and then move the second series of tests over to Christmas Island. So the Narvik was recalled from its journey and given 2 missions back to Malden. First of all, to pick up all the sensitive equipment that was necessary for the tests and to take that back to Christmas Island. And then secondly, to go back to Malden again and take off anything that showed of the activity that had taken place there. So Brian led the shore party on both of those occasions, and he tells me that the experience of leading those shore parties back to where the detonations had occurred has left a lasting impression on him. So with Christmas Island then prepared for the next batch of tests, the Narvik and Brian was sent on its way. I'll talk very, very briefly about the Christmas Island tests, but before I do, I just want to reflect upon the so-called failed 3 tests. If you look at the yields that they produced, what is it, 300, 720 and 200, and these were failures. Cast your mind back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1625, and look at the devastation and the destruction caused by them. And it makes you wonder why it was ever necessary to pursue a thermonuclear weapon with so much destructive capability. Well, it certainly gave Oppenheimer pause for thought, and he decided to pull out of the Manhattan Project, as you probably know, rather than to be associated with that. The tests on Christmas Island were widely accepted to be a success, and that's why most of the publicity that you see these days is about the Christmas Island tests, because that's the way the government span it. Very little publicity, very little coverage is given to the Malden tests, where the real pioneering work took place, and nobody knew what the outcome of those tests were going to be. But the government was able to say that it had achieved its status as a nuclear power, and so it was quite happy. But we're left to make a judgment call. I mean, there have been some good benefits out of the research into the nuclear technology, but it's a matter of judgment as to whether the world is really a better place for having developed the hydrogen bomb. I leave it to you. Anyway, I'll hand back to Brian now for some concluding comments on that.
Sorry, this is where it gets a bit sentimental in a way. If we go back to the slides that I showed you, addressed to me personally, it's quite clear in my mind, and I think you might agree, that the authorities knew very well indeed what they were doing. They knew that they were exposing the crew of HMS Narvik to radiation of some form, probably. They knew that they were exposing the crew to unknown experimental bombs. It was not as if they could prove what was going to happen. And what really puzzles me, actually, is if they knew all that, and there can't be any doubt that they did know because they published it, then why, therefore, did they order us all to stand in a formal parade on deck to witness the 3 bombs? I leave you to ponder that one, because quite frankly, I don't know the answer, except I think we were just guinea pigs. Oh yes, sorry. Yes, thank you, Brian. I don't know whether anybody's going to ask me. I have got a medal for doing this, and it's frankly it's almost useless. I just think it's a sop. But what I do have is that, and that is a very, very treasured possession, because there are only about 50 of them, and they were given to the crew and those of us who were witnessing the bombs on Malden Island. And I don't know whether you can read what it says. I doubt if I can now. It says Operation Grapple, forward area, Malden Island, 1957, Sub-Lieutenant Pearce. Thank you, folks. Can I just say, in here, I don't know whether you want to see them or not, but there are all sorts of different bits and pieces. Give you an idea, as I say, Brian photographed all those slides, but that's the sort of thing that the Admiralty sent out. That's come out of my logbook, and they're all there if you want to have a peep at them. And there are the 2 logbooks and the diary as well. But please remember, they're 70 years old.
Please do come up and have a look at they're fascinating folks. Please do come up afterwards. Got time for a couple of quick questions.
A couple of things, two questions really. I mean, one obviously is a more serious one, is the health effects on your crew, if you know of the history. And also, in heat and all that, what was the noise?
The noise, well, it was just a big bang, basically. I mean, really, that's the only way I can explain it. I mean, it was more a sensation of, if you can imagine, do you remember Buncefield? Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, it was a massive explosion, obviously. It was more a thud than anything, I think. That's the only way I can describe it. Yeah, it was like sort of the, yeah. But no, I mean, Brian mentioned this. The one thing that you won't hear many people, particularly from Christmas Island, mention was going back onto the islands afterwards. And first of all, I was asked actually this question: weren't we worried about radiation on the island? And you know, I'd never even thought of it. There was no provision made as far as I was concerned, and I was leading my crew, well, some of my crew. But secondly, the impact was one of, if you remember the slide of Hiroshima, when there was that skeleton, well, the island was littered with birds. They'd all been burned, of course. They died of starvation if they hadn't been blinded, and all their feathers had been burned off, and so on. So the smell, even nearly a month later on, the smell was something that I remember. It wasn't violent. I think it would have been violent if if it hadn't been for the passage of time. But again, I just I don't know. I just despair of the callousness of the authorities of putting us through it. I really do. I just cannot understand. And then I mentioned this to my granddaughter, and she said, oh, she's a very highly specialised nurse, and she said, Granddad, just think of us all with COVID, and we were told to go into the wards, and we had no protective clothing either. So it's not anything it's not isolated, unfortunately. I'm afraid it happens. Authority takes over.
Has there ever been any acknowledgement or apology for using the crew as guinea pigs?
No.
Oil results or anything?
No. We're the only government that hasn't. The Australians and the New Zealanders and the etc. The other people who are involved have all acknowledged and paid compensation. I'm not looking for compensation, please don't misunderstand me, but no, our government has always denied liability and won't admit it now. And that's why I find that medal so trivial. And the other thing that really irks me is that people who are only on Christmas Island, not the fact, are claiming that it was top secret. Well, hold on a minute, we had a press cutting. And then one other guy was sort of saying, oh, well, he was the guinea pig. Well, he was 500 miles away. You know, I just think it's all been... I'm sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
Take a couple more.
Presumably there was no concern about security for this operation. I mean, bearing in mind, quite a few Valiants and Canberras were detached here, so obviously something was going on. The thing that interested me was the fact that beer cans, especially, there was a legend on beer cans, specially canned for megaton trials.
And it says Christmas Island, it doesn't mention Malden Island. And the reason for that, of course, it was originally intended all to be on Christmas Island. And it was only because it became so apparent that you were going to put the risk of the crews for the bomber, well, the RAF and the Army on Christmas Island were going to be exposed to what we were exposed to, and they didn't know what that would be. That was the only reason why it was moved to Malden Island, was to protect the personnel on Christmas Island. And that caused a huge ruction with New Zealand, bless their hearts, because it was getting a bit warm in their general direction. And the Japanese were the other ones that their fishing fleets.
So a technical question, do we know how the bomb was detonated? Was it remotely detonated or by pressure?
No, well, go back to Orford Ness. That's what we were testing there. You had to have 5 different OKs before it would detonate. One was from Downing Street. I'm trying to remember what they all were. One was from Christmas Island itself, which was the bomber command, etc. One was on our ship, on the Narvik. We had to say, well, no, actually ours was the last. The last signal went to say, OK, detonate. Now, who actually detonated it, I'm not absolutely sure, to be honest. Well, I know there were 5 different OKs before it could be detonated, but I can't remember who had the final say. I would have thought the scientist, probably. Aldermaston, possibly. I don't know, is the honest answer. Sorry.
Final question, sir.
Earlier on, you showed the slide where the Admiralty gave the details of potential decontamination for gamma rays. Were you ever offered any decontamination when you came back from the island?
The only protection we had, what I personally had, and I don't really remember when that was introduced, was like, you know, if you see the nurses in X-ray with a little badge and it turns colour, etc. Well, we had one I can't remember when we had those. They appeared at some point during, I can't remember when actually, to be honest. That was the only, yes, no, that was the only protection we had. There were Geiger counters. We did have, well, no, some of the crew had counters to try, because when they went back to get the film out from the, I mean, they were back on Malden Island within, I suppose the helicopters took them in probably no more than 4 or 5 hours after the explosion, to go and collect the films from the various bunkers where the cameras were located. And then we used DUKWs. Do you know what a duck is? Yeah, and we used those for a lot of the transport as well.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for taking all those questions.
No.